Hello and welcome to Dialogue. A U.S. congressional delegation to Asia led by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been postponed after Pelosi tested positive for COVID-19 late last week. The trip is reportedly to include a stop in the Chinese province of Taiwan. The Chinese side has urged the U.S. to cancel the trip to the Taiwan region rather than postpone it. The twist comes at a time when people are exploring what lessons Asia could learn from the ongoing Ukraine war. What could the U.S. hope to gain by Pelosi's visit? How much damage would such a trip bring to relations between China and the U.S.? What lessons could Asian nations learn from the Ukraine conflict? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined today by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at American University, and Dr. Syed Mahood Ali, Associate Fellow at the Institute of China Studies at the University of Malaya. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Victor, we'll start with you. For viewers who are not familiar with the Taiwan issue, they would ask, why China is always so sensitive to the Taiwan question. Give us some, background information why the Taiwan question is so important to China.
Well, fundamentally, even countries like the United States acknowledge that there is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. Now, the very complicated situations across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait is actually a handover of the unfinished civil war between the nationalist government in China in the 1940s, especially 1947, 48, 49, and the communists in that period. Eventually, the national government was defeated on China's mainland and fled to Taiwan and stayed there ever since. So, in a sense, the unfinished civil war is the exact legal status of the relations across the Taiwan Strait. Ever since the early 1980s, the Chinese government on China's mainland has advocated peaceful reunification rather than reunification by force. Now, when the United States and China established diplomatic relations back in 1979, the United States acknowledged that there is only one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government of China. And the United States even went as far as to cancel its diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, that is in Taiwan, abrogate its defense treaty with Taiwan, and withdrew all the U.S. troops which were originally stationed in Taiwan. Now, in the world, there is no country at all which recognized two China, or one China, one Taiwan. Because the rule of the thumb is that if you recognize the PRC as the sole legitimate representative, you cannot recognize Republic of China at the same time. There are only about a dozen countries which still recognize the Taiwan rather than the People's Republic of China. But that argument is not whether there are two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. It's really as to which country they recognize as the representative of China. So in this sense, when Nancy Pelosi, who ranks number 3rd in the United States government hierarchy, when she wanted to visit Taiwan, it will be perceived as a strong provocation against China, against the Chinese nation, and also a violation of the one China policy that the United States government has acknowledged ever since 1979.
Yes, we will touch upon Nancy Pelosi's visit a bit later on. Peter, from the U.S. point of view, I know like China and the U.S., they agree there's one China principle, but they stress different points, let's say, in terms of the Taiwan issue. Tell us more about that.
Well, in the United States, the view is China represents the main threat to American security, more than Russia, more than more than international terrorism. The view is that China is America's main competitor and that we have a fairly hostile relation. And the U.S. focuses on several things. They focus on the situation in Hong Kong. They focus on the situation with the Uyghurs, which is presented in the U.S. media as effectively a brainwashing operation. They focus on China's large demands in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And so the U.S. paints a picture of China as an aggressor, not just a competitor, but a competitor that doesn't play by the international rules that the U.S. and its allies have established. Taiwan is seen as an independent country with a democracy. And after what's happened in Hong Kong, with the crackdown by the Chinese government in Hong Kong, the view is that if Taiwan joins with China again, then Taiwan's democracy will be snuffed out, that the Chinese will enact the same kind of repressive measures in Taiwan that they do that they've done in Hong Kong. So the idea is that the U.S. has been strengthening Taiwan's independence, not quite pushing the people to declare independence, but giving them the military means to resist a Chinese forced unification with Taiwan. So the United States has been giving a lot of defense armaments to selling them to Taiwan. The U.S. has been doing what it can. The new bill, it's not just Pelosi's visit that Victor mentioned, but the America Competes bill is effectively oriented toward China and Taiwan and reinforces America's commitment. The United States is somewhat ambiguous about whether it's going to actually defend Taiwan if China tries to seize Taiwan by force. But the United States has been, if anything, making clearer in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that it's going to stand up and protect Taiwan. So that the tension has been growing. Lately, the situation has become more and more tense and in some ways more and more hostile of late.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Ali, from Asian nations' point of view, how do Asian nations view the Taiwan question? It's sort of like the most sensitive issue between China and the United States.
As you know, most Asian countries recognize that they have to live in this region. They have seen great powers come and go over the last 2 centuries, particularly European ones. They have experienced imperial exactions and colonial depredations. So they have developed a perspective which is slightly different from, for instance, the European one or the Euro-Atlantic perspective. Asian countries tend to consider other viewpoints than the ones that are promoted or advanced in Europe or in North America. So they are much more willing to consider history as a definer of their understanding of their reality today. And I think except for Singapore, which for a brief time engaged militarily in training with Singapore Army, no Asian country, none that I can remember, has engaged militarily. They have commercial and cultural and other engagements, people-to-people exchanges, but no formal diplomatic relations are visible at the moment. So I would say that most Asian countries have a slightly different perspective to what we have heard from the Atlantic viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Victor, obviously, this is a dangerous situation, right? From the U.S. point of view, I think in the Senate hearing, basically, senior Pentagon official basically make it clear that Taiwan is of critical national security interest of the United States, indicating that even there's a peaceful reunification that will not be accepted or not be allowed by Washington. So I think this is the danger probably people refer to when we talk about, there's the ongoing Ukraine crisis. What about Asia? What could Asia learn from this Ukraine crisis? What about Asian nations in the peace and security? Big issues here.
Well, if we talk about the Taiwan issue, I would say if the United States government and the American people really want to see peace prevail across the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait, then stop arms sale to Taiwan. Because the more arms sale to Taiwan, the more inflammable will be the situation, and there will be a point of no return when they push the situation beyond that point of no return, then there may be really liberation of Taiwan or reunification of Taiwan by non-peaceful means. That will trigger a war across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. So I think the better way is for the United States really to promote peace across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait and urge the two sides of the Taiwan Strait to engage in dialogue and negotiations, for example, to work out a mutually acceptable arrangement for the peaceful reunification, rather than sending more and more lethal arms to Taiwan, which really may push the situation beyond the point of no return. So it really depends on how the United States government define the situation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Eventually, I think fundamentally, the Chinese government has made it very solemnly that the unification of Taiwan is purely a domestic internal affairs of the Chinese people across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. No country, including the United States, has any legitimacy in any say in preventing the reunification of Taiwan. And I think this is the megatrend in our time. And the United States need to acknowledge that this is a megatrend. They cannot have the cake and eat it. They cannot recognize the PRC as the sole legitimate representative of China when they recognize Taiwan as part of China, and they still want to intervene in the reunification of China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, back in 1997, there was the U.S. House Speaker, then Newt Gingrich, visited Taiwan. But he was from a different party, Republican Party, from the administration is a Democratic one. And now Pelosi is from the same party as Biden's administration. So do you think the trip is not only Pelosi's idea, but also the Biden government's idea?
The Biden government has been making clear its hardline policies toward China since it first took office. It came in with the intention of confronting China. Biden surrounded himself with advisors from the Center for New American Security, many of whom are China hawks. These are the same people who were behind the Asia pivot in the Obama administration. And so they made clear that their main priority is confronting China and containing China. But 1997, when Gingrich went, was a very different time. Not only was he from the other party, but China was relatively weak in 1997. Since then, China has been challenging U.S. hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region. China has tremendously built up its military forces, has the biggest navy in the world now, is increasing its nuclear arsenal, and it's got tremendous capabilities in that region. The Pentagon has run 18 war games between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, and China has won all 18. That would not have been the case in 1997. So the fact that Pelosi is from the same party as Biden has also sent former U.S. defense officials, former U.S. security officials to Taiwan, and has been strengthening ties. Some of these closer diplomatic relations certainly began under Trump. Mm-hmm. But Biden, rather than changing policy, Biden has doubled down on Trump's aggressive policies toward China, trade policies, military policies, but including over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So the tensions have been ramped up as a result.
So Victor, there's a danger, I think for a lot of people on the mainland that, with the Pelosi's visit, the trip itself could encourage or embolden the pro-independent government in Taiwan. If they declare independence, the mainland will be forced to do something really serious. I don't think that would be in the interest of Taiwan or in the U.S. or in the region.
Allow me to make two brief points. One is that regarding the point that our American professor made, I think if there is any hostility between China and the United States, it is not originated or initiated by China. And that hostility is not being reciprocated by China. China does not view the United States as an enemy or as an adversary. China wants to have a good cooperative relations with the United States, and the Chinese people do look at the United States and the American people as those people that we can get along with, we can cooperate for mutual benefit. Now, secondly, I hope American decision makers will not underestimate the wisdom of the Chinese people across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. I personally believe the Chinese nation on both sides of the Taiwan Strait will have enough wisdom and vision and courage to figure out how to achieve unification by peaceful means. So don't be surprised and don't be outsmarted by the wisdom of the Chinese nation. I truly believe the reunification of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait is the mega trend in our time. The American government will need to come to terms with that mega trend rather than to become a force obstructing that reunification, because otherwise the United States government may be enemy of the Chinese nation for 1,000 years to come. What will be any good of that kind of scenario?
Right. Dr. Ali, not long ago, there's a video summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, in which President Biden reiterated his China policy, basically said that he respects the one China principle, one China policy, and does not seek to change the political system in China, does not seek whatever basically conflicts with China. But if you look at his policy on the ground, it is very hostile toward China. What do you make of that?
Well, I should like to go back a little bit. We know this because these are in official archives, that as early as 1st January 1979, when the United States and the People's Republic of China normalized their diplomatic relations, on that very day, the US Congress had already enacted the Taiwan Relations Act, which then became law exactly on the same day as normalization took effect. And the TRA, as it is called, directly challenged the legitimacy and the validity of the substance of the recognition by the United States of China's sovereignty over Taiwan. The two mutually contradict each other. That's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is that thereafter, in 1982, when President Reagan visited China and on the 17th of August issued a joint communique on limiting arms sales to Taiwan, he also issued an interpretation of that communique to all officials of the US government, saying that the linkage between PRC conduct towards Taiwan and the quality and quantity of US arms supplies to Taiwan were directly linked forever, or words to that effect. This is well known within the US government, and it is a permanent feature of US foreign policy. It has been since then. And also on the same day, 17th of August 1982, the United States permitted the government of Taiwan to publish what the Americans called the 6 assurances. Now, the 6 assurances came in 3 different versions. The first one was published by the government in Taipei. The second one was testified to by a US State Department official in Congress a few hours later. And the third one was sent to Taiwan on the 10th of July, 35 days before 17th of August. And that one made the point that the United States had not taken any position with regard to Taiwan's sovereignty. And that ambivalence and ambiguity remains today. But as has been mentioned in this discussion, China is now viewed as the principal source of American anxiety vis-a-vis its primacy. Its systemic primacy is under threat and challenge. And China is the source of the most acute, what I call displacement anxiety. And it is in that context that developments over Taiwan are now coming to play.
Dr. Ali, can you talk more about this displacement mentality or anxiety?
Sorry?
Yeah, the displacement anxiety. What do you refer to? Can you talk more about that?
Yes. Well, if you look at From about 2007, the Department of Defense, RAND Corporation, has been publishing reports for US Armed Forces and another two federally funded agencies. One is called the Center for Naval Analysis, it's in Arlington, Virginia, and the other one is CSBA, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. All of them have been suggesting to the US executive branch that China poses grand strategic challenges to US systemic primacy or US global leadership, and has done so for some years. It is the only country with the economic, political, and scientific and technological capability to challenge America's systemic primacy or world leadership, and no other country comes near it. More significantly, I should like to point out that in July 1999, the Office of Net Assessment, part of the Department of Defense, in its annual summer study came up with two understandings. The first one is that China was emerging as a constant competitor, and second, India was likely to serve as a swing state. So if India joined China, then American primacy, systemic primacy, would be very severely eroded. On the other hand, if India could be taken on board on the American side, then the US primacy could be extended almost indefinitely. That has been the foundational thinking since that time. So I would say that we can even go back further, why the United States is determined to retain its primacy. You may remember that on the 23rd of April 1992, just about 2 months after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Department of Defense came up with a defense planning guidance for five years, and President Bush signed it off on the 23rd of April 1992. That said, the United States will prevent the rise of another great power that could challenge the United States the way the Soviet Union had. This would be, if you like, the seminal principle on which US post-Cold War grand strategy has been designed. That continues.
Yeah, Victor, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think our distinguished Malaysian friend outlined the contour of the U.S. attitude towards China very correctly. But allow me to mention 2 points. First of all, I think the United States decision makers are really confusing two things together into one. Why? Because they believe that if China ever keeps expanding to a point of surpassing the United States in many important categories, then it will be the time when China will take over the global leadership from the United States. Now, allow me to make two separate arguments. One is that the mega trend of our time is that China will keep growing peacefully, and there will be a time when the overall size of the Chinese economy, measured by official exchange rate, will surpass that of the United States. This is the megatrend. No country, including the United States, can stop that, because I would argue that to deprive the Chinese people their right of peaceful international economic development probably will constitute the biggest crime against humanity. Don't try to do that. But whether an expanded and enlarged China will take over global leadership from the United States, that's questionable. In China, nobody wants to be the top dog in the world. Nobody wants to be the hegemon, as some of the American analysts keep arguing that China wants to be the hegemon in the world. No, China sees no fun and no pleasure of becoming the hegemon or to replace the United States of becoming the hegemon, because what China stands for is multilateralism centered around the United Nations, where every country will be equal. No country should dictate terms to any other country. So this is, I think, China's vision for the future, and it does not constitute any challenge to whatever leadership role the United States defined for itself. So I think, rather than confusing these two things together, the American decision makers need to come to terms with this separated binary argument, that is, the size of the economy, whether China is larger than the United States or vice versa, does not dictate that China will want to take over the global leadership from the United States. Nothing can be further from the truth than this false argument.
Well, if you look at the Ukraine war, which is a larger background, and Asian nations want to avoid any repeat of that kind of scenario. Of course, there's on one level that's Russia attacking of Ukraine. Before that, if you go back a little bit, that's NATO eastward expansion since the end of Cold War. There were 5 rounds of expansion, bringing NATO members from 16 to 30 and pushing its boundary eastward by 1,000 kilometers, basically at the doorstep of Russia. Dr. Ali, now in Asia, what we are seeing is, of course, there are several probably flashpoints, but Taiwan probably is one of the most serious one. You see the U.S. policies like a Quad, the security framework with India, Japan, Australia, and then you have AUKUS with the U.S., UK, and Australia. Of course, beyond that, you have Five Eyes and bilateral security cooperation between U.S. and some of the regional countries. How do Asian nations see this Ukraine war, and what kind of a worry do you think they have about the peace and stability in their region?
Well, you have mentioned a number of Asian countries that are allied, formally allied to the United States, and some are called strategic partners, not directly allied, but otherwise they're collaborating and working very closely together because they share certain insecurities vis-a-vis China or some other sources of insecurity, but nonetheless they work closely together, and you have mentioned those. Countries other than those directly involved in alliance activities, building up some sort of a, you could say, an encirclement, a tacit encirclement around China, countries that are not doing that, they are, I think, more focused on what you might call hedging and internal balancing. They are not quite certain which way things will go, but they do realize one thing, that if there is a major conflict between the United States and China in this region, then they are bound to suffer its consequences quite grievously. And they may not have the resources to stand aside and not take any side, but the consequences will definitely affect them very adversely. They are watching extremely carefully and trying to devise a combination of external balancing and internal balancing, regional grouping, collaborating together, trying to see whether non-alignment can be revived in some form. It is proving an extremely difficult challenge for countries which are not directly or formally linked to either side. For them, this is a very difficult time, what you call a systemic transitional fluidity, which imposes a degree of strategic uncertainty, which has not been experienced since the end of the Cold War. And now we are seeing a period where almost nothing can be predicted, and everybody is pretty much left to their own devices, which is a very difficult thing to happen.
Well, Dr. Ali, very briefly, do you think there's anything they can do to help preserve peace and stability or ward off any potential, say, escalation of tensions or even war?
Well, in terms of the theory, it is possible for systemic primates, for example, the United States since the end of the Cold War, and China, the United sees China as its gravest source of insecurity. They need to engage with each other. The great difficulty with this is, if you notice, over the last dozen years or so, Chinese leaders, when engaging with US counterparts, have always mentioned 2 words: respect and equality. And the Americans have never quite directly responded to that.
Well,
there has been no response to Chinese plea for respect or equality.
With that, we come to the end of today's show. Again, many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.